Evening, friend. Come sit by the fire. There's a chill out there tonight, and that's a fine thing, because the story I've got for you tonight is a hot one. A story about a summer so dry the ground cracked open like old leather, and two stubborn men who went looking for the same water under the same dead field. Pour yourself something cool to drink, settle back, and let the cold night air do its work while I tell you about the long, dry summer of 1883, down in a little valley called Dry Fork. Let your breathing slow. Let your hands go loose. There's nowhere you need to be. And let me tell you how 91 days without rain brought two old enemies down to the bottom of the same dry hollow, each with a shovel over his shoulder. 91 days. That was how long it had been since a single drop of rain had touched the cracked earth of Dry Fork, and every soul in that valley had been counting, the way you count the breaths of someone you love who is fallen ill. The creek had gone to a thread, and then to a memory. The grass had turned the color of old bone, and on the 91st morning, two farmers who had not spoken a kind word to each other in years, each took up a shovel and walked out to the same dry hollow between their lands, because each of them had felt, in the night, the one thing left in all that valley worth fighting for. Water, moving somewhere down in the dark beneath them both. Welcome to Western Sleep Story, where the Old West carries you to sleep. Every week, I sit by this fire and tell a new tale. Slow, calm, with nothing but the crackle of the flame, and a story worth drifting off to. If you're new here, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. And if these stories help you rest, that little subscribe button means you'll never have to look for the fire again. It'll be right here, waiting. Now, settle in. Let me tell you how the dry summer began. It started, as these things do, with a sky that simply forgot how to rain. The valley of Dry Fork lay long and shallow in the high plains country, a green and gentle place in an ordinary year, watered by a creek that came down cold out of the hills to the north and ran the length of the valley before it turned and went its way. There was a town at the heart of the valley, a small one no more than a single street, with a church and a store and a smithy and a scatter of houses. And, spread out around the town, up the gentle slopes on either side, lay the farms, wheat and corn and hay, and cattle on the higher ground, the patient work of patient people who had come to that valley to make a life out of dirt and rain and time. For the rain had always come. That was the thing the people of Dry Fork had built their lives upon. The quiet certainty beneath everything, the way you build a house on the certainty that the ground will hold. The spring rains came soft and long and woke the seed. The summer rains came in the afternoons, great towering thunderheads that climbed up wide over the hills and broke open warm over the valley and were gone by supper time, leaving the air washed clean and the crops drinking deep. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. It had been that way for their fathers and their fathers before them. And then, in the spring of 1883, the rains came thin, and in the early summer, they did not come at all. At first, the people of Dry Fork were not afraid. A dry spell was nothing new. Every few years the rains came late, and the folks grumbled and watched the sky and went on with their work, and sooner or later the clouds gathered and the rain fell, and all was well. So when the first dry weeks went by, the people of Dry Fork watched the sky and waited, the way they always had. The old men sat on the porch of the store and read the sky the way other men read a newspaper, and they spoke of the year it had been dry like this, and how it had broken, and they said it would break again. There had been a dry year when they were boys, they said, dry as a bone, clear into August. And then one evening the clouds had come up black over the hills, and the rain had fallen for 2 days straight and made up for everything. The land remembered how to rain, they said. It always remembered. You only had to wait and keep faith and not let the dry get into your spirit. And sooner or later the sky would do what the sky had always done. The younger folks listened and took comfort and waited. But it did not break. The days went by, hot and white and cloudless, one after another, each one exactly like the last. The afternoon thunderheads did not come. Some days a few high, thin clouds drifted over, and the people would stop their work and look up and feel the small lift of hope. And then the clouds would thin and scatter, and the sky would go white and empty again, and the hope would settle back down, a little heavier each time. The creek began to shrink. That was the first thing anyone could measure, the first hard sign that this was not an ordinary dry spell. The creek that watered the whole valley, the cold creek out of the northern hills, began to draw back from its banks. The deep pools where the children swam in summer grew shallow and warm and green. The riffles where the water had always chattered over the stones went quiet, and the old men on the porch of the store stopped saying it would break and began instead to count the days. That was how the counting started. Nobody decided to do it. It simply began the way worry begins, passed from one to another in the quiet way that everything was passed in Dry Fork. How many days now since the last rain? And someone would reckon it up and say the number, and the number would go round the valley, and the next day the number would be one larger. And so it went. 30 days, 40. The number grew, and as it grew, the valley grew quiet. The way folks go quiet when the thing they are afraid of stops being a possibility and starts being a fact. There is a particular quality to a drought, friend, that those who have not lived through one cannot quite imagine. It is not like a storm or a flood, a sudden disaster that comes and is gone. A drought is slow. It is a thing that happens by not happening, day after day after day, a long accumulating absence. Each single day is only a fine, clear, sunny day, the kind of day a person might be glad of in another season. It is only when you set them in a row, all those fine, clear days, one behind another stretching back and back, that you see the shape of the thing, and the shape of it is terrible. The sky stayed beautiful all that summer in Dry Fork. That was the cruelty of it. Day after day the sun rose into a clean and lovely sky and crossed it slow and set in colors of rose and gold, and the people of the valley watched that beautiful empty sky and felt their lives drying up beneath it. By the time the number reached 60 days, nobody in Dry Fork was watching the sky with hope anymore. They were watching it the way you watch a sick bed. And down at the southern end of the valley, on two farms that shared a fence line and not much else, two men named Elias Vance and Orrin Tate watched their crops turn from green to yellow to the dry, pale gold of death, and watched their wells sink lower, and each of them, alone on his own dying land, began to think about water in a way that a man only thinks about water when he has begun to run out of it. Now I should tell you about these two men, because the whole of this story turns on them, and you cannot understand what they did at the bottom of that dry hollow unless you understand what lay between them first. Elias Vance and Orrin Tate had been neighbors for 19 years. They had come to the valley within a season of each other, young men then, each with a wife and a wagon and a head full of plans. And they had taken up the two farms at the southern end of Dry Fork, side by side, sharing the long fence line that ran between them down the middle of a shallow, dry hollow. They had even helped each other those first weeks, the way new neighbors do in the new country, raising each other's barns, breaking each other's first ground, sitting at each other's tables of an evening, too tired to do anything but eat and be glad of the company. For a little while at the very start, before any of it went wrong, Elias Vance and Orrin Tate had been something close to friends. That was the part neither of them ever spoke of, in all the cold years after, that it had not always been so, that there had been a brief good season at the beginning when each had been glad the other was there. Perhaps that was why the quarrel cut so deep when it came. The worst quarrels are so often between people who were once close and remember it, and cannot forgive each other for the remembering. And almost from the first, well, near enough to the first, they had not gotten along. It is hard to say after 19 years what started it. These things are always hard to say. Perhaps it was the fence line itself, and exactly where it ought to run, a question that had cost them a hard week of words their very first summer, and had never entirely been settled in either man's heart. Perhaps it was a strayed bull, the year the fence went down in a storm, and whose corn got eaten and whose fault it was. Perhaps it was nothing more than the simple friction of two proud, stubborn men set down close together on hard land, each certain he knew the right way to do things, each unable to abide watching the other do them differently. Whatever it was, it had hardened over the years into the kind of quarrel that no longer needs a reason. They did not speak, beyond what neighbors must. They did not lend each other tools, nor ask for the loan of any. When their paths crossed on the road to town, they nodded, stiff, and passed without a word. Their wives, who would dearly have liked to be friends, kept a careful distance for the sake of their husband's pride. Their children grew up across a fence from one another, half curious and half forbidden, the way children are about a thing their parents have decided to dislike. Their wives carried it hardest in the way that wives often carry the cold things their husbands build. Sarah Vance and Ellen Tate had liked each other on sight. Those first years, two young women set down far from anyone, in a new, hard country, each badly in need of a friend. They might have been the dearest of companions they had wanted to be, but their husbands' quarrel had grown up between them like the fence itself. And over the years, the two women had learned to keep to their own sides of it, a wave across the field, a stiff politeness in the churchyard, and never more, for the sake of two proud men who would have taken any friendship between their wives as a kind of betrayal. It was a small grief, set against the larger ones of a hard life, but it was a real one, and both women felt it year after year, every time they passed close enough to speak and did not. Elias Vance was the older of the two by a few years, a tall, spare, gray-eyed man, quiet and hard and proud, who had buried a son in infancy long ago and had carried something closed and careful in him ever since. He farmed his land well with a kind of grim devotion, and he did not suffer fools, and he had decided long ago that Orrin Tate was something of a fool and had seen no reason in 19 years to revise the opinion. Orrin Tate was shorter, broader, louder, a man quick to laugh and quick to anger, generous with his friends and stubborn as a stump with anyone who crossed him. He thought Elias Vance a cold and joyless man, too proud to bend and too stiff to forgive, and he had told him so once, years back, in the heat of an argument over that everlasting fence, and neither man had quite forgotten it. So there they were. 19 years of small, cold war. Two families living a stone's throw apart and a world apart. Two men who had taught themselves so thoroughly to dislike one another that they no longer had to think about it. It was simply the shape of things. It was simply the way the southern end of Dry Fork was, and then the rain stopped, and the wells began to fail, and the question of water came down on both of them like a hand pressing on the back of the neck. And a strange thing began to happen down in that dry hollow on the fence line between them, in the dead of the hot, still nights. Both men, lying awake in their separate houses, listening to the wind that brought no rain, began to hear, or to imagine they heard, or to dream they heard, a sound that should not have been there at all. The sound of water, moving faint and cool and steady, somewhere deep below the cracked floor of the hollow that lay between their lands. Here is the thing they had both noticed, though neither had spoken of it to a living soul, least of all to each other. At the bottom of the dry hollow, right on the fence line, halfway down the long, shallow fold of land between the two farms, there grew a single old willow tree. It was not a remarkable tree. It had been there longer than either man leaning over the fence with its long, trailing branches. And in 19 years, neither Elias nor Orrin had given it much thought beyond the occasional curse when its roots fouled a plow or its branches wanted trimming back off the wire. But that summer, as the valley died, the willow stayed green. Everything else went. The grass in the hollow burned to brittle gold, and then to gray. The cottonwoods up along the dry creek dropped their leaves in July as though it were already autumn, trying to save themselves. The wheat died in the fields, and the corn curled and rattled in the hot wind, and the whole valley went the dull, dead color of a thing that has given up. But down at the bottom of the hollow, the old willow on the fence line stayed green, not lush, not thriving, but alive, its narrow leaves holding their color while everything around it crumbled to dust. A willow does not stay green without water, friend. Any farmer knows that. A willow is a thirsty tree. It grows where the water is, along the creeks and the springs and the low wet places, and it sends its roots down deep and wide to find the wet. In an ordinary year, a man would never think twice about it. Willows are green. That is simply what willows are. But in a year when every other green thing for a mile had turned to dust, when the cottonwoods had given up and the grass had died and the very creek had failed, a single tree holding its color was a thing that caught the eye and would not let it go. It was like a lit window in a dark and empty town. It meant something, and a farmer, above all men, knows what a green tree means in a dead land. It means water. It means there is water down there where the roots are, in the dark and the deep, when there is no water anywhere else in all the world. And so when Elias Vance, walking his dying fence line in the cool of an early morning, stopped and looked at that stubborn green tree, a thought came into his mind that had not been there before, a slow, careful farmer's thought. That tree has found water. There is water down there, under the hollow, under the fence line, under the dead ground between my land and his. He said nothing. He walked on and finished his rounds and went back to the hard work of trying to keep his stock alive. And he did not let himself think too hard about the green willow or the water beneath it. But the thought had taken root the way a thought will, and it grew quietly through the long, hot days that followed. And on the other side of the fence, Orrin Tate had looked at the very same tree on his own morning rounds, and had thought the very same thought. He, too, said nothing. He, too, walked on and went about his work. But he, too, could not stop thinking about that green willow and the cool, deep secret it was keeping under the dead and cracking earth. Two men, the same tree, the same thought, and a fence line running right down the middle of the hollow where the willow grew, so that no man could rightly say whether the water that fed it lay under the Vance land or the Tate land, or, and this was the heart of the trouble, the thing that would bring them both down into that hollow with shovels in their hands, directly under the fence itself, in the disputed strip of ground that had been the root of their quarrel from the very beginning. 19 long years before, the well at the Vance place gave out first. Elias lowered the bucket one hot morning, and he came up holding a sad cupful of muddy water, and no more. And he stood there in the white sun, looking down into the dark, dry mouth of his well. And he knew that the time for saying nothing was over. The well at the Tate place failed 3 days later. Orrin stood over his own dry well and came to the same hard knowledge in the same hard way. There is no sound quite so hollow, friend, as a bucket coming up dry from a well that has always given water. A man lowers it the way he has lowered it 10,000 times, by feel, not even thinking, his mind on the day ahead, and instead of the cool weight, the gentle resistance of the bucket settling into deep water, there is only the light wrong knock of wood on mud, the slack rope, the emptiness coming up. Elias Vance felt that wrongness in his hands that morning before his mind had even named it. And he stood at his own well in the white sun looking down into the dark, dry mouth of it. And he knew that the time for saying nothing was over. The well at the Tate place failed 3 days later. Orrin stood over his own dry well and came to the same hard knowledge in the same hard way. The slack rope in his broad hands, the hollow knock coming up out of the dark. And meanwhile, in the town at the heart of the valley, something worse was happening. The town well, the deep old public well that had given water to 3 generations of Dry Fork, the well that the whole town leaned on. The town well was going dry too. It was a woman named Hattie Pell who drew the last good bucket from the town well, though of course she did not know it was the last when she drew it. She was the wife of the storekeeper, a kind, broad, capable woman who had lived in Dry Fork her whole life. And she went to the town well that morning, as she had gone 1,000 mornings, and let the bucket down on its long rope, and felt it hit not the cool slap of deep water, but a soft, sucking, heavy resistance. She drew it up slow, and it came up holding mud, thick gray mud, and a little water swimming on top of it. And that was all. She stood there a long moment in the hot, still morning, looking down into the bucket, and then she looked down into the dark mouth of the well, the deep old well that had never once failed in all the years of the town, and a cold understanding settled over her despite the heat. She set the bucket down on the stone rim. She did not cry out or run to fetch anyone. There would be time enough for that. She simply stood there a moment with the truth of it, the way you stand a moment with bad news before you have to go and carry it to others. Then she picked up her muddy bucket and walked home slow to tell her husband that the town well had begun to die. The news went round the valley by nightfall, the way all news went round. The town well is failing, and a kind of quiet fear settled over Dry Fork that was different from anything that had come before. The crops were one thing. The crops were money and a hard winter and a lean year. But water to drink was another thing entirely. Water to drink was life. A man can stand to lose a crop. He has lost crops before and lived to plant again. But there is an old animal fear that wakes in a person when the water itself begins to fail, a fear older than farming, older than words, the same fear that has driven every living thing since the beginning of the world to the water hole and the spring and the green place by the river. It is a quiet fear, and a deep one, and it had begun to wake now in the people of Dry Fork, one household at a time, as the barrels went down and the wells went dry, and the great white sky gave nothing back, and the people of Dry Fork, counting their dwindling barrels and their failing private wells, and the thin, warm thread that was all that remained of the creek, understood for the first time that this dry summer was not a thing they would simply suffer through and forget. This dry summer might be a thing that broke 'em. It is a strange thing about hard times, friend, and a beautiful one, that they bring out the best in good people even as they bring out the worst in the country itself. The people of Dry Fork did not turn on one another in their thirst. They did the opposite. They pooled what water they had and shared it out by household, careful, and fair. The storekeeper keeping the count, the strong carrying barrels to the old and the sick. Children were sent round to the families with babies to make sure the little ones had enough. The men dug together at the failing creek, sinking holes in the dry bed to catch what seeped, and shared out what they caught. For all the fear in the valley that summer, there was a great deal of quiet kindness, too, neighbor to neighbor. The kind of kindness that does not make the newspapers but holds a town together when the ground itself seems to be giving way. They did what people do. They gathered at the church, and the preacher led them in prayer for rain, and the rain did not come. They rationed what water they had, sharing it out careful and fair, the strong helping the weak, the way a good town does in a hard time. They sent a rider south to ask after water, and he came back to say it was dry there too, dry everywhere, the whole country burning under the same merciless white sky. And they watched the heavens day after day, 90 days now and counting, and the heavens gave them nothing but more sun. They sent a rider south to ask after water. A young man on the strongest horse left in the valley, and he was gone 4 days. And when he came back, his news was the hardest of all. It was dry everywhere. Dry to the south, dry to the east. The creeks failed and the wells failing and the cattle dying in the fields of every valley he had crossed. The whole wide country was burning under the same merciless white sky, and there was no help to be had from anywhere, because everywhere was the same. The people of Dry Fork heard the riders muse in the church in silence, and after that a kind of quiet settled over the valley that was deeper than fear. It was the quiet of people who have understood at last that no one is coming to save them, that whatever was to be done, they would have to do it themselves, out of their own ground, with their own hands. And down at the southern end of the valley, 2 men on 2 failing farms heard the news of the town well, and each of them thought, in the privacy of his own hard heart, about the green willow in the hollow and the water beneath it. Because here is the thing that the dry summer had done, friend. It had taken the old quarrel between Elias Vance and Orrin Tate. The fence, the bull, the cold 19 years of it, and it had poured all of that old poison into a single new vessel. The water under the hollow was no longer just water. It was the last water. It was their families' lives, and maybe the town's life too. And it lay under a strip of ground that both men had claimed as their own for 19 years. Each of them lay awake that night in his separate house, listening to the dry wind. And each of them, toward morning, made the same decision. Come daylight, he would take up a shovel and walk down into the hollow and start to dig, and he would get to that water first, and he would make sure it was his. Neither of them slept much, and when the gray of the 91st morning came at last to the valley of Dry Fork, 2 doors opened on 2 farms, and 2 men stepped out into the dawn with shovels over their shoulders and started down toward the same green willow at the bottom of the same dry hollow, from opposite sides at very nearly the same moment. Now, if you're still awake and this fire is keeping you company tonight, I'm glad you're here. If you'd like more nights like this, a subscribe and a quiet little tap on that bell means I can keep these stories coming, one fire at a time. But for now, let's get back to where we were. 2 men are walking down into a dry hollow at dawn, each meaning to claim the last water in the valley. And neither one of them knows yet what they're really going to find down there. They reached the willow from opposite sides of the fence at very nearly the same moment, and they stopped and they looked at each other across the wire, and for a long beat neither one said a word. Each had hoped, walking down through the gray dawn, to find the hollow empty, to have the willow and the water to himself, to dig in secret and present the other with a finished thing he could not argue with, and each, seeing the other already there, shovel in hand, the same hard purpose written plain on his face, felt the hope go out of him and felt the old anger rise up in its place to fill the hollow it left behind. The morning was already warm, the light coming gray gold and level across the dead valley, and the old willow stood between them, its narrow leaves hanging still in the windless air, the one green thing in all that gray and gold. Elias Vance stood on his side, tall and spare. Orrin Tate stood on his, broad and square, his own shovel in his, and the thing that each of them had come down to do alone, in secret, each now found the other had come to do as well. There was no hiding it. They both knew. They had both seen the green tree and both thought the same thought, and both come at dawn with the same tool to do the same deed. It was Orrin who spoke first, because Orrin always spoke first. "Get on back to your side, Vance," he said, and his voice was rough with a dry throat and a bad night. "That water's under my line." "Your line," said Elias, slow and cold. "That willow's been growing on my side of that fence for 19 years, and you know it. The water's mine. The water's under the fence. You stubborn old fool. Same as it's always been, and that strip's mine and always was. That strip is mine." And there they were, friend, right back in the middle of the same argument they had been having for 19 years. The same hard words over the same hard ground. Only now the ground had water under it, the last water in the valley. And so the old quarrel had teeth in it that it had never had before. Their voices rose in the still morning. They said the old things, the fence and the bull and all of it, dragging up 19 years of grievance in the gray dawn light. And then Orrin Tate, hot and frightened and pushed past the edge of his patience, drove his shovel into the dry ground of the disputed strip, right at the foot of the willow, right on the fence line, claiming it with the blade. And Elias Vance drove his shovel in not a foot away, and the two of them, glaring at each other across the wire, began to dig. It would be a fine thing to tell you they fought. That is the story the dry summer seemed to be writing. Two desperate men, the last water, an old hatred, a fence line. That is how such a story usually goes. A reasonable man hearing the start of this tale would lay money on blood before it was through. Two proud, stubborn enemies, 19 years of grievance, and the last water in a dying valley between them. There is many a story from that hard country that ended exactly so, with one man in the ground and the other no better off, and the thing they fought over worth nothing to either in the end. But that is not how this one went, and the reason it went otherwise is the reason I am telling it to you tonight by this fire, all these years later. It went otherwise because of the digging. It went otherwise because of what the work does to two men who do it side by side, no matter what they have decided to feel about each other. The dry summer meant to write a story of blood. The shovels wrote a different one. They dug, furiously at first, each trying to reach the water before the other, flinging the dry gray dirt up out of the deepening holes, breathing hard in the climbing heat. The sun rose higher, the ground grew harder and stonier as they went down, and the digging slowed, the way digging always slows, and the two men, working a foot apart on either side of the fence, began to spite themselves to fall into a rhythm, dig and lift and throw. Dig and lift and throw. Two tired men in two deepening holes under the green willow. In the white roar of the heat, the sun climbed, and the heat came down, and the two men dug. There's a rhythm to digging, friend, that takes a man over after a while, that does his thinking for him, so his mind can go quiet and empty as a swept floor. The blade goes in, the foot drives it down, the arms lift the weight, the body turns, the dirt flies, and the blade goes in again. Over and over, slow and steady, a thing as old as people in dirt. And two men digging side by side, even two men who have come to fight, cannot help but fall into one rhythm together, the way two people walking side by side will fall into one step without deciding to. The thud of the blades found a kind of time. The gray dirt rose in turn from the two deepening holes, and the heat pressed down, and the willow hung still and green above them, and the morning wore on toward noon. And as they dug, something began to happen that neither of them intended, and neither of them could have stopped. They began, without meaning to work together. It started small. Orrin hit a stone too big to lever out alone, and without thinking, without a word, Elias reached down and helped him heave it up, because that is simply what you do when a man beside you is fighting a stone, even a man you have hated for 19 years. A little later, Elias's hole struck a seam of hardpan, and Orrin, without a word, passed his pick across the fence so the older man could break through it. They did not speak of these things. They did not look at each other, but the rhythm held them, and the work held them, and the two holes crept downward side by side through the long, hot morning toward the water they could both now faintly hear. It took them 3 days to reach the water. 3 days, friend, of the hardest, most stubborn labor either man had ever done. They did not plan to keep working together. After that first morning, each went home at dark to his own house, sore and silent, fully intending to come back at dawn and dig faster, dig harder, beat the other to the water, and have it for his own. But each dawn they came back down into the hollow and found the other already there, and there was nothing to do but take up the shovel and dig, side by side, in the deepening shade of the green willow. And a strange thing happens to two men who labor together at a hard task, friend. It does not matter what lies between them. It does not matter what they have decided to feel. The work has its own laws, older than any quarrel. When you have spent a long day breaking the same stubborn ground beside a man sharing the same heat, handing the same tools back and forth, hauling each other up out of the same deepening hole, when the footing gives, when you have done that, something passes between you that no 19 years of cold nodding on the road can hold out against. By the end of the first day, they were no longer flinging the dirt to claim the ground. They were lifting it to clear the way. By the middle of the second day, the two separate holes had become, for all practical purpose, one, a single broad shaft sunk down on the fence line under the willow, with the old wire fence itself in the way of the work, so that on the afternoon of the second day, without a word, without so much as a glance exchanged about it, the two men took down a length of the fence that had stood between their lands for 19 years, and set it aside and went on digging in the single hole they now shared. That was the moment, though neither of them marked it. The fence that had been the very root of their quarrel, they pulled it up themselves with their own hands, because it was in the way of the water, and laid it gently to one side and never put it back. There is a thing that happens to the body in hard shared labor that the heart cannot argue with. The two men's hands blistered and broke and bled a little and went hard. Their backs ached so that each of them, the first night, could barely climb the stairs to bed. They learned each other's strength and each other's weakness in the whole. Learned that Orrin was the stronger over a short, hard pull, and Elias the steadier over a long one. Learned to hand the work back and forth between them according to which suited each. They drank from the same dwindling water jug, passing it up and down because there was nothing else to drink from. They sweated the same sweat in the same heat, and by the second morning, when Elias came down into the hollow and found Orrin already at the bottom of the shared hole, and reached down without a word to take the loaded bucket, Orrin lifted up to him. The strangeness of it had worn clean away, and it was simply two men at a job of work, the way it had never once been in 19 years. They began to talk, somewhere in there. Not much. Not about the quarrel. Never once in all 3 days did either of them speak of the old grievances they had shouted across the wire that first morning. They talked of the work, of how deep they reckoned the water lay, of the stones and the seams and the best way through them, and then, slowly, of other things, of the weather and the years of it, of Elias's stock and how he was keeping them alive, and Orrin's and how he was not. And then, on the evening of the second day, sitting exhausted on the lip of the shared hole, as the sun went down red through the dusty air, Orrin Tate said something he had never said to Elias Vance in 19 years. He said he was sorry about the boy, the son, the one Elias had buried in infancy, all those years ago. He had never said it. There had been a quarrel already by then, and pride and the years had closed over it. But he said it now, in the hollow, in the dusk. And Elias Vance was quiet a long moment. And then he said thank you in a voice gone rough, and that was all. But it was enough. It was 19 years' worth of enough. It had been a hard thing to carry, that unsaid sorrow, harder than Orrin had ever let himself know. He had been a young man himself when the Vance boy died, with young children of his own, and he had felt the horror of it the way any father feels another father's loss. A cold finger laid on his own heart. He had meant to go and say something, but there had already been words between him and Elias by then. The first of the quarrel, and pride had risen up, and the moment had passed, and then a week had passed, and then it was somehow too late, the way these things get too late. And the unsaid words had sat in him for 19 years like a stone he could not put down. And now, in the hollow in the red dusk, worn down past his pride by 3 days of shared labor, he set the stone down at last. He said he was sorry about the boy, and Elias Vance, who had carried his own stone all those years, the grief locked away behind the closed, careful thing he had become. Elias was quiet a long moment, looking out at the dying light over the gray valley, and then he said, "Thank you," in a voice gone rough, and something in him that had been clenched tight for 19 years let go, quiet, in the dusk, where no one but Orrin Tate would ever know it had happened. On the third day, they reached the water. It came as a darkening of the soil first, a coolness rising up to meet their hands as they dug, and then a slow seeping, and then, as Elias drove his shovel down hard into the cool, dark earth at the bottom of the shaft, a sudden welling, clear and cold and sweet, rising up around their boots in the bottom of the hole. They had been so long in the heat and the dust and the dry that for a moment neither of them quite believed it. Elias bent and cupped a handful and brought it to his face, and it was cold, truly cold, the deep cold of water that has never seen the sun, the cold of the dark places under the earth. And he drank it, and it was sweet and clean as anything he had ever tasted, sweeter for the 90 days of thirst behind it. He looked up at Orrin with the water running down his gray beard, and Orrin bent and drank too, there in the bottom of the hole, the two of them on their knees in the rising cold water under the green willow. The spring, the hidden spring that had fed the willow all through the killing summer, the last living water in all the valley of Dry Fork, rising up clear and cold into the hands of the two men who had dug down through 3 days and 19 years to reach it. They stood in it, both of them, ankle deep in the cold rising water at the bottom of the shared hole. And they looked at it, and they looked at each other, and neither one of them said a single word about whose it was. They could have fought over it even then. The thought hung in the air a moment, in the bottom of that hole, with the cold water rising around their boots. The old thought, the dry summer thought, mine, the last water, mine. But it did not take. It could not take, not any more. Not between two men who had just spent 3 days hauling each other up out of the dark, and one long red dusk, laying down a grief 19 years old. The water rose around their boots, clear and cold and plentiful, for it was a good spring, a deep one, far more water than the willow had ever needed, more than enough. And Elias Vance looked at it rising, and looked at Orrin Tate, and said the thing that ended the quarrel forever. "There's enough here," he said, "for both our places, and the town besides." And Orrin Tate nodded slow and said, "Reckon there is." That was all. That was the whole of the treaty between them, struck ankle deep in cold water at the bottom of a shared hole under a green willow. After 19 years of war, there's enough for both. Reckon there is. And the people came. That first evening after Vance and Tate brought the news to the church, a few of the bolder ones came down to the hollow with buckets, half not believing it, and found the spring just as the two men had said, cold and clear and rising sweet out of the ground under the green willow. Word went round the valley that night faster than any news all summer, and by the next morning there was a quiet, steady line of folks coming down the dusty road to the south end of the valley, with barrels in their wagons and buckets in their hands, and a look on their faces that had not been there in 3 long months. Elias and Orrin had widened the hole into a proper basin, lined it with stone, and the cold water filled it as fast as the people drew it down, for it was a deep spring and a generous one. The two men took turns, those first days, helping folks fill and load, asking nothing, and after a while they did not even need to be there, for the people of Dry Fork minded the spring themselves, careful and grateful, the way you mind a thing that has saved your life. They did not keep it for themselves, friend. That is the part of this story that they still told in Dry Fork long after both men were gone. They could have. Two hard men, the last water in a dying valley. They could have walled it round and sold it by the cupful and made themselves kings of that thirsty country. Plenty of men would have, but Elias Vance and Orrin Tate had gone down into that hollow as enemies and come up as something else, and the something else would not let them hoard what they had found. They went to the town together, the two of them walking up the single dusty street, side by side, which was a sight that stopped people in their doors, for no one in Dry Fork had seen Vance and Tate within 10 feet of each other in years without hard words passing. They went to the church, where folks were gathered in the heat, and they told them plain. There was water, a good spring, a deep one, down in the hollow on the south end, enough for everyone. And the people of Dry Fork could come and draw from it, free for as long as the drought should last. And they did. That was how the valley of Dry Fork came through the long, dry summer of 1883, on the water of a spring that two old enemies had dug down to together and then given away. All through the rest of that killing summer, the people came down to the hollow with their barrels and their buckets and drew the cold, sweet water and carried it home and lived. The children came and the old folks and Hattie Pell, who had drawn the last bad bucket from the dying town well. They came to the spring under the green willow, where the fence had been taken down, and they drew life out of the ground, and they did not go thirsty. The rain came at last in September. 91 days had become more than 120 before the sky finally remembered itself. It came the way the old men on the porch had always said it would, in the end. The great gray clouds building up black over the northern hills one heavy afternoon, taller and darker than any cloud the valley had seen in months, and a cool wind running ahead of them through the dry grass, carrying that smell that every soul in Dry Country knows and loves above almost any other, the smell of rain coming over hot land. The people of Dry Fork came out of their houses and their fields and stood looking north at the dark wall of cloud, hardly daring to hope, having hoped so many times that summer and been let down. And then the first fat drops came down, slapping the dust, raising little puffs of it, one and then another, and then 100, and then the sky opened, and the rain came down at last, warm and heavy and long, drumming on the dry roofs, running in the dusty streets, soaking down into the cracked and grateful ground. The people of Dry Fork stood out in it and let it soak them to the skin, and some of them laughed and some of them wept, and the long dry summer was over. The creek came back in time. The wells filled. The next spring the rains came soft and long the way they always had, and the valley of Dry Fork turned green again, as though the dry summer had been nothing but a hard dream. The crops grew, life went on, the way life does, folding the hard year into memory and moving forward into the easy ones. But some things did not go back to the way they had been. The fence between the Vance place and the Tate place, the one the two men had pulled up themselves to get at the water, they never did put it back. Where it had run, down the middle of the hollow, there was only the open ground now, and the spring, and the green willow standing over it. The two farms ran together at that low place, and no one could quite say any more whether one ended and the other began. And after a while, no one tried to. Elias Vance and Orrin Tate were friends for the rest of their lives. Not the easy, laughing friends that some men are. They were both too old and too set for that. And Elias never did learn to laugh as easy as Orrin. And Orrin never did learn to hold his tongue as well as Elias. But they were friends in the deep way, the way of two men who have labored together at something hard and come out the other side changed. They lent each other tools now without being asked. Their wives, freed at last, became the friends they had always wanted to be. Their children courted across the open ground where the fence had been, and in time there was a wedding. And after that the two families were one family, and the old quarrel was not even a memory to the grandchildren, who knew only that great-grandfather Vance and great-grandfather Tate had once dug a famous well together in a famous dry year. Sarah Vance and Ellen Tate became, in the end, the friends they had always been meant to be. With the fence gone and the quarrel buried, there was nothing left to keep them apart, and they fell into each other's company that autumn like two people making up for lost time, which is exactly what they were. They quilted together through the winters. They minded each other's grandchildren. They sat on each other's porches in the long evenings and laughed about the foolishness of their husbands, who had wasted 19 good years on a fence and a bull and a strip of dry ground, and had needed the worst drought in living memory to knock the stubbornness out of their heads. The two women had a great deal of laughing to catch up on, and they'd caught up on it. The children courted across the open ground where the fence had been, as I said, and in time there was a wedding. Elias's granddaughter and Orrin's grandson married in the church in the valley on a soft green day in spring, with both old men standing up front, stiff in their good coats, trying not to weep and not quite managing it. And after that, the two families were one family. The Vance blood and the Tate blood mingled together for good, and the long quarrel was not even a story to the children of that marriage, who knew only that they belonged to both old farms at once, and that there was a famous spring at the bottom of the hollow where a willow grew, and that their great-grandfathers had dug it together in a year so dry the whole valley nearly died, and the spring ran on. It never failed again, not in the worst of the droughts that came after, and the people of Dry Fork came to think of it as the town's own. The water that had saved them, free to all. They kept the willow trimmed and tended. And the old folks told the young ones the story, the way I am telling it to you. How in the killing summer of 1883, when there had been no rain for 91 days, and the last water in the valley lay hidden under a strip of disputed ground, two men who had hated each other for 19 years went down into a hollow to fight over it, and came up instead, with their quarrel buried and the water shared, and saved the whole valley between them. Nobody ever could say for certain why the willow stayed green that summer when everything around it died. A willow finds water. That is all. It sends its roots down to the wet and it holds on. It is a simple thing when you look at it plain, a matter of roots and depth and the patient seeking of a tree for what it needs to live. But the old folks of Dry Fork like to say it was something more than that. They like to say the willow had known all along what lay beneath it and had stayed green through the dying summer, not to save itself, but to show two stubborn men where to dig and what they might find at the bottom of all that hard ground. If only they would dig down to it together. I cannot tell you whether that is true. I am only a man by a fire, telling a story the way it was told to me. But I have lived long enough to believe that there is more wisdom in the slow, patient world than we hurried people often credit, and that sometimes the thing we most need to find is sitting in plain sight all along, green and quiet, waiting for us to stop quarreling long enough to notice it. The fire is getting low now, and that is the way I heard it told. The fire is getting low now, friend, settling down soft and warm. And somewhere far off and long ago, a green willow stands over a cold spring in a valley that does not go thirsty anymore. Because two old men once dug down past their own hard hearts and found enough water for everyone. There's a lesson in that, I expect, but I'll not spoil your rest by spelling it out. You already know it. Most of us do, down deep, even when we forget. You rest easy tonight. Whatever dry ground you've been digging in lately, whatever old fence you've been guarding, let it be just for tonight. The water's deeper than the quarrel. It nearly always is. And if this story gave you a quiet place to land, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who could use a peaceful night. Leave me a word in the comments. Tell me where the fire took you tonight. I read every one. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.